I must begin by expressing my profound gratitude to Villanova University for the honor that they have done me. It is an emotional moment, and I find words difficult. But I was warned that I would be most remiss as an Irishman if I did not thank Villanova University for its contributions to Ireland, because all our distance runners who attained world status have all been trained at Villanova. Now, Joe and I, in order not to duplicate, have agreed to say a few words in St. Paul, so I will outline his life, and Joe will deal with his theology. Now, a Roman legion never went into debt. At the end of a campaign, if the books weren't balanced, the finance officer sent out patrols to collect any able-bodied citizen. They were then sold as slaves, and the books balanced. Now, Paul's parents came from Upper Galilee, and at the end of the revolt that followed the death of Herod, they were taken as prisoners and were eventually sold in Tarsus. That worked to Paul's advantage, because when his parents were manumitted by a Roman citizen, he acquired citizenship, and his owner gave him the beginnings of a first-class education. We now know from an examination of the letters that Paul's education went to the highest level of a famous pagan university. The University of Tarsus was listed as the third in the ancient world. But of course, like many assimilated Jews, about the age of 20, Paul went to seek his roots in the Holy Land. He became a Pharisee, and so he knew Judaism from the inside. And this became important at a later stage because, contrary to what some think, Paul does not criticize the theory of Judaism, which of course is election and grace. Paul criticizes the practice of first century Judaism, which was focused on observance of the law. He also, at this stage, was much smarter than most Christians, because he realized that their confessing of Jesus as the Messiah meant that they were in reality repudiating the law. Christians tried to have it both ways. They were Christians, followers of Christ, but they observed the Jewish lifestyle. For Paul, it was not both and, it was either or. And this worked very well in Paul's moment of conversion. Once he was confronted with the truth of Christ in his Damascus experience, then the law fell away. He was already psychologically prepared. It was one or the other. As a persecutor of the church, of course, he believed in the law. Jesus was wrong. He was not the Messiah. But once he accepted the living Lord as truly Jesus of Nazareth, then the law was finished. It no longer had a role in his thought. As a Christian, which was the second half of his life, Paul would have spent maybe 20 years in Tarsus, 15, 18 years as a Pharisee in Jerusalem, during which he was certainly married. His competitive sense, his claim, looking back at a lifestyle that he had abandoned completely, to say that he was the best in his class. You can't claim that and be disobedient to what every Jew accepted as a commandment. Marry, be fruitful, fill the earth. His life as a missionary is characterized by journeys. And we travel so comfortably that we don't really recognize what was involved. Because when Paul gives a list of his experiences in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, what he emphasizes were the dangers that he encountered in cities, in villages, on the road, on the sea. Shipwrecked 3 times. He was very lucky. And just imagine the physical strength that was necessary. Also, his journeys provided food for his theology. When Paul went to an inn at night, he rented a bed in a room that had no door, and he didn't know who'd be in the other beds. If he lost his little packet of tools, he was lost, because there was no charity anywhere near or on a Roman road, because everyone from the legate of the legion to the lowest private could requisition whatever they wanted. So people stayed as far away as possible. He had to earn his way. And curiously, he shows a rather upper class contempt for manual labor. But without that, without a skill, he would have had no mobility. So he had to protect his tools. He had to assume that everyone else in the room was a potential. He wanted to be another Christ, a man for others, to trust people, to win people, and he had to assume that they were thieves. That's where Paul recognized that sin, the false value system of the world, was a forced people to be other than they would wish to be. And this became a fundamental element in his analysis of society and his thinking that gave him the solutions to these problems. His mission was governed also by relations with other churches, notably the Church of Antioch, which had originally sent him out as a missionary, and the Church of Jerusalem. As Antioch veered more and more towards Jerusalem, Paul found himself less and less in sympathy with his sending authority. Eventually he broke with Antioch. And Antioch didn't break with Paul, because the churches that Paul had founded as a minister of Antioch, Galatia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, they were daughter churches of Antioch. And a good section of Paul's life was dealing with the delegation that had been sent out by Antioch to reform the law-free churches that Paul had founded. It was because of these Judaizers that Paul had to think for the first time. And it is, I think, appropriate that the people who forced Paul to think were the Irish. Because Galatians were Celts. The people that he met in the middle of Asia Minor had in fact come from the Pyrenees. And St. Jerome, who passed through there 4 centuries later, recognized the same language that he had heard up on the Rhine. And it was the Galatians, in their reaction to the Judaizers, that forced Paul to think about Christ in a very individual way. In my view, Peter could have written 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But only Paul could have written Galatians and the letters, the subsequent letters, that developed the key ideas that emerged in Galatia. His last visit to Jerusalem was fraught with danger. At the end of Romans, he prays that he won't be killed. He realized the extent to which he was hated by the Jews. As James said to him, you tell everyone not to follow Moses, not to keep the customs. Due to a lucky accident, an alert sentry, Paul was saved, shipped down to Caesarea. He wouldn't pay the bribe, so he languished for several years until he finally appealed to Rome. Then it was a little late. The sailing season was over, and so not surprisingly, he was shipwrecked on his way to Rome. But he survived that. So what happened in Rome, we don't know from Luke. But I'm convinced that he was liberated and that he followed through on his plan to visit Spain. There was no reason why he shouldn't have done so. But it all went wrong. He didn't have the language, there were no synagogues, he had none of the supports that he enjoyed in the East. So with his tail between his legs, he came back to the East and tried to do something in Ephesus, ended up with a small mission in Miletus, and it was there he got his last chance. The word that Nero was persecuting Christians in Rome, he was using them as torches on the Aventine to distract the people of Rome from the idea that perhaps he had started the fire of Rome. Paul realized he was by now an old man, towards the end of his 60s certainly, if not already 70. He had all his work behind him. He could not see any new mission fields, but to strengthen the Church of Rome. That's why he took the terrible risk of a high-profile missionary in a church that had been terrified by the bestiality of Nero. And because a magistrate was prepared to play it safe, not to offend the authorities, he had Paul executed in the fall of 67, when, by my calculation, he would have been just about my age. Why was Paul so successful? Because his mission was not only in words, but in deeds. He says that he himself carried in his body the dying of Jesus in order to manifest in his body the life of Jesus. He was, for his generation, what Jesus had been to his disciples in Palestine. And it is because of Paul and his total commitment in person and to the very end that we are where we are today. Thank you very much.